Ara History Untold has been labelled the civilization killer, though in reality the game plays a little bit more like a blend between Anno and Civilization. A grand strategy, largely I would argue focused on its economy, its good simulation game. Here we'll discuss the good, the many bad, and the ugly points, and figure out whether Ara History Untold is a winner or not. So let's begin with the good stuff, the positives of Ara History Untold. It's very much, in its early game, a very familiar Civ-like experience. However, it's not exactly a carbon copy. It's more like Civilization 6 or maybe Civ 5 meets Anno, because there's much more of a focus around materials from each region, and then using those materials to make goods to provide your city with a whole load of yields based around its efficiency and happiness, its productivity as well. Now, these regions are divided into tiles, and you'll build improvements on the tiles. That part very familiar. However, the Anno element comes in when you start using your materials to produce goods like I'm doing here with some basic tools. And these goods can supply cities to basically improve everything that I just talked about. Their prosperity, their productivity, their science, how healthy and happy the population are to boost their growth or production. These yields, I think, are a big win for Ara History Untold. They're fairly easy to use. The core mechanic that's driving this game, which is goods production and yield production, is really laid out, in my opinion, at its best here. And it's supported by some other good features as well that I'd like to highlight in this first section, like the events, which not only give you a steer toward kind of overarching goals and challenges, but also reward you or generally task you with some kind of trade-off. I also like the way that the game has implemented its version of great people, of advisors, of great works, all of it kind of merged into one. You get these Paragon figures routinely, and of course you can increase the speed within which you unlock these figures through various means, tile improvements, buildings, the civilization that you're playing perhaps. These figures are very important. You can swap them around from foreign advisor to a military force bonus, to a domestic advisor, depending on their strengths. And they can also produce these great works which add to your prestige. Prestige in Ara History Untold being perhaps the ultimate driving factor towards winning a game. And basically everything you do, which we'll look at later, from military actions to how many regions you have, cities, the overall happiness and health of your people, all of that feeds into your prestige. So that's kind of the driving element behind the game, and fundamentally how it works, or at least the parts of it that I like. This is, after all, the good section. I think that this view of the cities as well, by the way, or the regions when you go to claim and expand out a city, is also very highly functional. It feeds into that core crafting amenities loop of the game. I like it a lot. However, all of this stuff is surrounded by what I consider to be some fairly significant downsides, some of them easy to fix, others perhaps not quite so much, and the complexity, like adding specialists to tiles, assigning amenities to cities to make the most of the goods that you're producing, also have some downsides as the game moves on. One final thing to note though, because it is a massive strength for some of you who are watching this video, Ara History Untold is, I believe, included inside of Xbox Gamepass for PC, that is, anyway. So, if you already have that subscription, or if you just want to try the game, the barrier to entry here is fairly low. And that should actually be stressed as a significant positive, particularly as we move into some of the first negative points. Finally, I think that the game tackles the interest of a simulation, seeing people walk around, seeing your cities, regions, and tile developments change through the ages, as well as its wonders or triumphs, very well. I like them all, they have a great aesthetic to them, and they produce what is kind of more of a grand strategy economic simulator, rather than another carbon copy trying to steal that secret sauce of civilization. I think that the other elements surrounding the game, like its religion, also deserve perhaps a quick shout out. It's a fairly straightforward system to understand. You build stuff to spread your religion, but I like it nonetheless. Now let's change a little bit. Let's focus on the bad. To begin with, I really have to stress that this game seems to be having some fairly significant performance issues. And initial reception to the game is very mixed, with reviews sitting at around 60% positive, it would be fair to say. Performance is one of the key hang-ups, particularly as you move through the game. And generally speaking, the player count reception on Steam hasn't been all that hot. Although, of course, Game Pass is playing out here as well, I suppose. Back to the topic at hand, though. I have ran into a lot of the issues that I'm seeing people report. Sounds freeze, they hitch, they just play it over and over and over again, sometimes on end turn. There are graphical issues with the look, with certain natural features being where they shouldn't be, as well as some UI bugs. And finally, and most importantly, the game crashed on me a few times. I noticed it tended to be when I was moving through one of the 12 technological errors. I don't know if that's a particular issue, but the crashing absolutely occurred. Another thing that I believe is objectively bad, it could also go in the ugly section, right? Subjectively. And maybe we will talk about it there again, is the UI. I believe it is just fundamentally bad and in need of some key improvements. Whether you like the aesthetic, the look, the font, I think it could use with a glow up. However, putting that to one side, I think it just kind of doesn't work as intended. One example here, as you're seeing, is how to select a project and how to train units. Something that completely skipped by me, just way over my head initially. When you first open up a city, this option is not obvious, that you must change from the city projects, the tile improvements, to units. It doesn't immediately pop up, it doesn't have an immediate overview, yet things like religion, for example, on the left-hand side do, or every single region, including full ones, on the zones on the right. You need to either open up the production queue, which also doesn't give you the option to just skip things all the way to the top, you have to do it one at a time. You need to open that up to find select project, and then find those little buttons to change to unit. If you don't do that, the city will tend, and the UI therefore, will tend to default you to just building improvements. You can build settlers basically straight away, but it is not immediately there and obvious to the player. I think that's one example. There are also many ways that ultimately, many pathways I should say, that ultimately lead to the same place. Like, as we'll see in just a moment, deploying military forces. There are two buttons down the bottom left you can see right now, some arrows pointing to it, that allow you to deploy armed forces. They both do the same thing, and they are both right next to each other down the bottom left there. Deploying forces is also quite cumbersome. You have to do it one at a time. Deploying, and then the way that the game works is you have to sort of give them a couple of turns to muster before you can move them. But that's not the specific issue here. It's not the time around it, it's that you have to do them one at a time. Click one, deploy it, click one, deploy it. There are just loads of things here that need to be cleaned up, tidied up. There shouldn't be loads of buttons all leading to the same thing through different pathways. It should be more obvious how to train units. Some of their key functions should be immediately available, not hidden behind what are generally speaking quite small buttons across the entire UI by default. The UI also plays quite a key role, of course, in combat and the game's simultaneous turns. Combat and units can sometimes be a little bit difficult to actually get a hold of, get a feel for. Here you can see I've selected to attack this animal, but because the game has simultaneous turns, the units just sit there firing arrows needlessly, and then as I end the turn, whoop, the battle is done, the unit has moved, and that's it. So combat in of itself is far more stripped back than in most other Civilization contenders, Civ-like games. And I consider this to be another drawback. While the battle scenes, which we'll take a look at in just a moment, may be somewhat visually impressive, the animations are generally just the same over and over and over again, and there really isn't a lot of strategic depth here aside from which units you muster up and bring over. The battle just plays out, you watch it, and that's it. Combat, therefore, isn't really a focus of this game, you might argue, and maybe you're right. It's an economic simulator where you build a civilization, and generally speaking, that's kind of where I land. I love this GTA wasted kind of finish here as well. Just take a listen to this. I love it. I just love the sound around it. Anyway, that is kind of all you get. Battles can play out over multiple turns if one army doesn't significantly overwhelm the other. And speaking of armies, the AI is another huge drawback here. It is not very good at training its units, not very good at moving them around. Even on the easier difficulties, it declares war with like 2 dudes. It's mad. Speaking of mad, let's move into the final section, the ugly. And things get a little bit worse here, I'm afraid. Again, we see examples of fairly basic, stripped back, and often not all that useful UI. But the crucial focus is actually what's on it, the acts. While I personally kind of like their ruthlessness, this can also be a really ugly drawback. A kind of a kicking you while you're down, and potentially discouraging players from playing later game civilizations. Basically, when a new act begins, the players at the bottom are wiped out. Not only does this lead to a kind of more vacant, even more empty feeling map, and it will feel quite empty, as by default the maps are very large, difficulty far too easy, and as you move through once, twice through the game's, of course, 3 acts and wipe out the 2 players at the bottom by default, the world will feel even emptier still. And this massive world is ultimately driven through those acts in simultaneous turns. And these simultaneous turns, as I've alluded to before when we've talked a little bit about the difficulty behind the game, ultimately, I feel, help to reduce a little bit of the life of the world, and also lead to some somewhat uncertain actions in a world that becomes increasingly about micromanaging cities. When you turn to combat, some actions are hidden. It may not always be obvious what you're supposed to do, and the fact that you just queue stuff up and then kind of wait and hope for the best ultimately removes all strategic nous and depth from the combat, really. Aside from, of course, the units that you're selecting, right? What you train and what you send in. Outside of that, it's just the GTA wasted battle screen playing out. And the simultaneous turns, the queuing up of actions, all of these things I think somehow capture something that I'm struggling to put into words, but ultimately make the game just feel a little bit lifeless in combination with its somewhat lackluster or at times confusing UI, performance issues and crashes. And that leads me into my early verdict. What have we discussed and how does it play out? Well, fundamentally, I think that the bones of this game are very interesting. And I think that Ara History Untold has tackled a kind of a crossover between 2 genres, a blend of civilization and something like Anno 1800, a sort of a grand strategy civ where economics and goods, these consumables that you give to your cities, really are the key focus, with other features being perhaps somewhat sidelined to really draw that out. However, the game's cumbersome UI, here I am having to move in and out to upgrade each of these buildings, is honestly a bit of a drawback. And as you move through into the later game, start unlocking more technologies. You start needing to replace a whole load of your improvements, upgrade them, build new ones, get fuel. These massive turning points in history, which are very fun to play out in the simulation, become very cumbersome. And again, not to just hammer home and just really rail on the UI, but because of those lack of efficiencies, because of those real drawbacks in the UI, it makes it quite a cumbersome late game, and one that can lead to a lot of just clicking through turns, end turn, next turn, waiting for things to pass through, or a whole load of what at times can feel like unnecessary micromanagement. I think that things like those upgrades, those amenity assignments, particularly though the tiles, the buildings, there needs to be a whole load of streamlining around upgrading those. Around perhaps also making it obvious to the player, a little more obvious maybe, what they should build and where. The UI in general does need a massive glow up. And those performance issues, the bugs that I talked about, those specific examples from earlier in the cons section, also need to be addressed before Ara History Untold can be a general easy recommend. With that being said, with those, again, very significant issues, hopefully at the front of your mind, I did enjoy my time playing Ara History Untold. I will continue to follow the game. And I think that, unfortunately, that classic trope, when a Civ-like civilization killer, if you want to call it that, a Civ contender, perhaps, might be a sort of a slightly nicer, slightly more adequate way of putting it. When any of these games come out, the case is always the same. Oh, you know, give it 2 or 3 years, some updates and some DLC, and it'll be a fun game to play. And I feel that that's probably the same verdict here with Ara History Untold, with a couple of small caveats. The main one being, it's on Gamepass. So if you're already a part of that subscription, you can try the game, and it could be a cheaper way to access it if you're not. The downside, I believe, on Steam, the game is currently fairly overpriced. For me, it was 100 New Zealand dollars, which is about 60 US. I feel in its current state, it's a little bit too early access to ask for that price. It feels a little bit early access in other ways too, that I've perhaps glossed over or not really focused on. While there are plenty of map settings, the lack of ability to change the game speed could be a significant turnoff for what can be a very long game, particularly as you move through. The simulation becomes more complex and you potentially run into the performance issues that seem to be plaguing around 4 in 10 players at the time of recording. The UI, the AI, both need some work, but Ara History Untold, I believe, is fundamentally at its core a slightly experimental and interesting take on the classic civilization formula by bleeding in some of that more economic, goods-focused depth that a game like Anno 1800 might bring to the traditional choose a civ and play through a game formula. There's promise here, but there are some glaring issues that need to be addressed. Thank you for watching. Let me know if you'd like some more Ara History Untold, maybe some tips or something, some gameplay, or shall we just focus in on the next thing? And Civilization 7 is, of course, on the horizon. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.